Hey guys, welcome back to the Debrief podcast brought to you by FingerLakes1.com. I'm Josh Durso, joined as always by Jackie Augustine, and we're here inside the FingerLakes1.com studio breaking down the latest headlines and things looking a little different around here. We're going to be going with a slightly changed format for those of you who watch us on Finger Lakes 1 TV or on YouTube. Not a lot is going to change, just the look of the show, and we're going to see some new faces. We're going to be cycling in some new guests. Of course, myself and Jackie will continue to host the show twice a month, but you might see some other people along the way too. That said, if you listen to us on the radio or listen to the podcast version of the show, no changes. You're just going to continue hearing people talk, which is exactly what you're used to. So, Jackie, here we are. Fall is in full swing.
Yes.
It doesn't feel like it, but fall is in full swing. We swear.
Well, this is the best way, I think, to enjoy it. You get the fall color, your fall experience, but you still get that reminiscing of summer so that you can be out to enjoy it. So, yeah, I mean, I like the crisp air too, but I don't know. I'm enjoying this kind of last hanging on of summer.
I think a lot of people are, honestly. But that also means we're getting closer to Election Day. Obviously,
Yes.
We're closing in on mid-October, which means roughly like a month-ish. We're going to be talking about some of the actual political and electoral news that we've been seeing in the last several weeks. But to that end, has anything caught your eye, or are you hearing anything from people who are obviously going to be voting in a month that maybe surprised you a little bit, or made you think, oh, that worries me, or maybe that makes me feel good?
Well, I think people are still engaged, which is great because I think that's important. And you might be surprised to know that I went to a talk over the weekend by Michael Steele, who's the former RNC chairman. And it was an amazing talk. He was excellent. And he was talking about we can complain about what's going on and what the outcome of various news cycle issues might be. But at the end of the day, we still have that ability to come out and vote and hold people accountable. And, obviously he's from a different political persuasion than I am. But I couldn't agree more with his message that these are like job interviews. And you are hiring people to represent you. If they get in there and do a poor job, your job is to go back and vote for somebody else, not to continue to support people that you think don't represent your interests. And I'm hoping people are starting to get that message and starting to understand, right, if I don't like what's going on, I do have some control over it. So I hope. That's always my optimistic view of things, but...
Hoping. I'm hoping there too.
Yeah.
The big thing for me, I think, is I'm hoping that we actually get to a point where there's some certainty about people turning out to vote, because I think that's still very up in the air. I was following a Twitter thread the other day talking about the millennial vote. That
right.
I'm not even sure it's a real thing anymore, because it seems to be there's this up and down. There was a real surge in the late 2000s, obviously, with Barack Obama, but I'm not sure that really thoroughly exists, because I don't think, especially in rural areas, that there's a whole lot of engagement with young people in politics. There isn't that connection happening, so remains to be seen. But getting into our topics for the day, of course, we're starting out with the tragedy in Schoharie. Probably one of the most, factually one of the most horrific accidents, traffic-related transportation accidents in the last decade. The plane crash in Buffalo in 2009 was the last really large one. So a limousine owned by a company that has a lot of questions attached to it crashed. 18 individuals were on board and killed, as well as 2 bystanders who were in the parking lot of a store nearby. The town supervisor of Schoharie says that that intersection underwent some changes by the DOT around 10 years ago. And since then, there have been accidents. I don't want to say a lot of accidents, but there has been an unusual number of accidents. Right. And they've actually banned tractor-trailer traffic at that T intersection. So what happened was, it's a hill, comes down to a T intersection. The limousine went through the intersection and then obviously crashed in a wooded area next to the parking lot of the country store. That said, there's also been a lot of questions about the limo. So the limo failed its last inspection in September, wasn't supposed to be on the road. The driver was not licensed to operate said limousine. And now there's some really bizarre stories circulating and some reporting by the Times-Union that the owner of this limousine company was actually an informant for the FBI in
I hadn't seen
terrorism, in terrorism related. So essentially, you have a father figure who is the owner of the company and owns several smaller limousine companies, a hotel or a motel, and then a couple other smaller organizations operated by his son. And it's this very, like, a lot of people have been questioning, like, there were a couple DBAs that were discussed, doing business as situations where, what is that really a fair way to operate? So you get to be one business and operate under. So there are tons of different, like, micro debates happening around this. Most notably, in my opinion, is the actual safety concerns around limos. Right. If you look at some of the reporting that's come out, there's a really good story. You have to go all the way back to 2015 by the New York Times. It actually goes through the safety concerns, long noted safety concerns with limousines, because they're essentially normal vehicles, just cut in half and then sort of stitched together in a not really that secure way. So these aren't, it isn't like getting a vehicle from the manufacturer. These sort of aftermarket changes are where I think the big question comes in. And, there have been a lot of state officials saying that maybe they need to look at different regulation, or maybe they need to look at a better way to handle and process these types of vehicles. I don't know that pure regulation is the answer, but I think there definitely needs to be some more structuring around, there needs to be more, the NTSB obviously doing their own investigation. There needs to be more safety precautions in place with limousines. There needs to be more regulation around the vehicle structure itself rather than the whole industry. Seatbelts was another interesting caveat where apparently back not too long ago, just a few years ago, the industry essentially said there aren't enough deaths per year to warrant requiring seatbelts as a federal regulation inside limousines. But now we have one accident where it crushes the threshold. There was a cost-benefit analysis done back in the day, and it didn't reach the threshold. And now, a lot of folks are saying, well, it's an insane way to do business or operate, especially when you're talking about people's lives, because in one single incident, which if it's mechanics, if it's driver error, if it's whatever the case may be, bad road structure, any of those things could happen in any situation, anywhere. So to say that, you need X number of deaths before you will act seems like a ridiculous way to govern or hold policy or, just do business.
Yeah, I generally agree with you that these kind of actuarial analysis where they try to determine, what the risks are and whether or not that means there should be a policy is generally the wrong way to look at it. I mean, what you want to look at first is whether or not the policy makes sense, and then if you can, flesh that out some more with some analysis or predictive modeling, that's great. But to let the predictive modeling guide the policy in the first place seems a little strange. But there's so much that you raised in this with regard to this issue that I agree with. I think the import for the Finger Lakes region, in addition to the fact that, there were local connections to people involved in the accident, and that's, terrible. It's just a terrible situation. But I think that looking at it regionally, we have a growing tourism industry that is based on wine tours, limo traffic to weddings, receptions, wine tastings. And I do think that people need to keep in mind that the vehicle, what's happening inside the vehicle, needs to take the safety of the people in the vehicle and on the road as the primary priority. So if limo drivers are focused more on making sure everybody's having a good time and not focused as much on their actual driving, or not if the company itself is focused more on the experience of the passengers in terms of fun and not the experience of the passengers in terms of safety, then I think that's the first issue. I think anytime you're looking at an event or a product or a business, your first concern has to be the general welfare of the people that are impacted by what you're doing. And I think, there are a ton of questions, from the structure of the business to compliance with existing regulations to the question of any additional regulations, that this is going to have a ripple effect in a lot of ways, a lot of good ways. So I think it's great that people are talking about those particular pieces. I don't want to lose the fact that so many people lost their lives and so many families are impacted by this. So I think, that is its own separate discussion, but how to respond to what has come to light or what will come to light as people examine this accident, I think regionally a lot of people will be paying attention, because I think it will, the idea that someone without the proper license or without the proper inspection on their vehicle could just decide that they're going to take a bunch of people out for the day should be something that everybody around here is concerned about.
Right, and I think that was sort of the part that really got me thinking about this whole thing, was because now as soon as you start to introduce, so you have the accident and you have the fact, this is what my brain is sort of processing the whole thing. You have the debate around seatbelts and the industry and this accident. And then you have the separate debate, which is going to be this company or this individual who is driving, or its management broke the law or failed to, adhere to certain regulations that already exist. And I just would hate to see potential regulation that could help people stay safe, like seatbelt regulation. I would hate to see that sort of clouded by lawbreakers are going to be lawbreakers comment, which I think we hear it a lot with the Second Amendment discussion and debate. And I would just hate to see that sort of cloud what really needs to be focused on. Obviously, if the company was wrong in how they were doing business, that is a problem, but the safety aspect, the regulatory aspect, needs to be kept separate to a pretty strong degree, I think.
Right.
Which really makes this whole thing very complicated. There are just so many different facets. It was absolutely fascinating to see all of the different layers of this story sort of come to light as soon as the NTSB got involved, because it was an accident. Mind you, it happened on Saturday. By Sunday morning, it took almost 16-ish hours before the NTSB shows up, and then everything really got going. Everything really got moving. There were press conferences on Sunday and Monday, and every day every hour it seemed there was more to this coming out. So it'll be something that we'll obviously be talking about more here as state legislators start to think about what could be changed here in New York State. But I think at the federal level is probably where the changes need to happen first and foremost, or should. Yeah. But at any rate, so let's switch gears a little bit and talk about one of these political electoral bits of news. So does the accusation of domestic violence impact the race that Senator Tom O'Mara and I don't want to mispronounce her name, but the candidate's last name is Kirchgessner, I believe. We believe. Yeah. We were trying to sort out how to pronounce this. Her ex-wife provided some testimony to the Ithaca Times. That story is linked down below in the video description if you want to learn more about it and sort of read everything that was said. A couple days later, the campaign came out with a statement denying most of it, saying that it was a sort of a mutual issue that had been, both parties had called the police at different times. There were police reports actually discussed in the original reporting, and then as well in the follow-up reporting. It seems that we see things like this pop up more and more frequently now. People I feel like more comfortable with discussing these types of things in a public setting, and when folks run for office, your entire profile as a person, everything you've done is fair game. Now, given the fact that we don't really have or won't really have due process, so to speak, right, in this situation, or at least not timely enough before the election, I'm wondering what you think in terms of how this impacts her, impacts the race, impacts the district, et cetera.
Well, I mean, this is an interesting topic because, I believe that Tom O'Mara on the merits should be challenged. I think that he has a lot of, and there's been a lot of news reporting about things that he has done while in office that have been detrimental or otherwise at least questionable to the district. And so on that front, I think it's great that a challenger emerged. However, you absolutely have to take these accusations seriously. I think it's important that people do feel now that they can come forward more readily. I hope that's the case. I hope that increases. I hope that continues. But what I found was interesting is that it wasn't until this accusation was raised that I learned, and I don't know if this had been explained in other news media, but I'd missed it, the fact that this particular Senate candidate had past DWI issue. So I think that sometimes when someone comes forward as a kind of character witness to say, are people aware that this person has this type of temperament, has engaged in this type of behavior, it oftentimes gets the news media to go back and give a more full profile of the person that's running. So I think, allegations of domestic violence, if credible, are disqualifying. And I think that past DWIs should be disqualifying, especially, I mean, I have low tolerance for that just in general, but I think that especially when a candidate did not in their introduction, when saying, hey, I'm interested in running, here's who I am, if we didn't get a full warts and all kind of, here's what I bring to the table, here's what's in my past that might be questionable, but here's why I still think that I'm a good candidate. So that is what I get more concerned about. That, and we saw that in the Supreme Court hearing. I don't like when people know that there are questions and they don't come right out and be forthcoming and say, before you hear this from anybody else, here are the things that you might be concerned about, and here's why I still feel like I can move forward. So this ties together a lot of issues. So I definitely think it's going to have a negative impact on her run.
Yeah, I think that one of the things that sort of bothered me about the headline and the story itself was the anger that I felt after the candidate released a statement. It seemed like anger bordering frustration, whichever way you wanted to sort of read it. Obviously, that's pretty subjective. But it just didn't. It was exhibited toward the newspaper for reporting on it and not going to what she felt were the appropriate lengths to get her side of it. And even after releasing a statement, there was still it seemed like a dissent to the charge, the idea, the possibility that, she could be responsible instead of just taking responsibility for whatever happened. Relationships are complicated. I think that's something that most people resonates with most people, especially voters who are looking for transparency. They're looking for realness out of candidates, authenticity.
Right.
Especially young people. Obviously, we were talking about the millennial vote, this mythical creature. I think that in a place like Ithaca, where you do have a high density of young people and you do have a high density of young people who are engaged, I think that authenticity is important. And I almost wonder that despite the breakdown of how, who's enrolled and where they're enrolled, party-wise, I almost wonder if this puts her in a spot that's a little bit difficult to come back from. She was already at a disadvantage, obviously, with it going against an incumbent. But now to have to also fight this with, just a few weeks left before the election, it seems very, very difficult. And I just would like to reiterate for probably the 50th time, people want authenticity.
Right. I think people just want the truth. They want people that they can trust, that even if they disagree with them, that they know that they're actually getting the straight answer. And that has become so rare, which is so sad. Now, some people will tell me it never existed. You're wishing that it did, but it didn't. But I don't know. I mean, and look at this. This has ties even to Geneva City Council. There are allegations against a sitting councilor of domestic violence. And I've got to say, I think people need to understand that there's, in a domestic violence situation, there's often a reluctance to call the police and involve the police in what's going on behind your closed doors. I think that's especially true amongst same-sex couples. So I do think the fact that there are police records about these incidences, talking now just about the issue in Tom O'Mara's district, although, again, it has some import in terms of Geneva. I think that people need to take that seriously, and they need to know, why did an elected official or a potential elected official either call the police or have the police called on them. And if that wasn't something you felt you needed to disclose, I think people want to know why. Why would that be kept a secret? Why is that not something that you share? That's part of your story. That's who you are. And people are electing someone to represent them. So I think disclosure is important.
Is it the assumption that these candidates, when they're getting into this arena, they don't fully understand or grasp the idea that your personal life is no longer personal?
No, I don't believe that's it at all. I think anybody who puts themselves forward for public office knows that you're getting into the ring where everything is fair game. You're
Really?
Becoming a public official. I don't think people like it. I think they feel put off if they want to be able to present a curated image of just the stuff they want people to know and not the rest. But I don't think fundamentally that they don't understand. I think anyone who goes into public office, that might be the number one thing holding people back from public office, is a sense that, well, I want to retain a measure of privacy. And you give that up when you get into public office. I think that people getting into it know that. I just think they can control it, that they want to craft a narrative, and there's some things that they think should be off limits, not because it would be off limits if they knew it about their opponent or if they knew it about another elected official. But I think, unfortunately, we get into a situation where people want to make exceptions just for themselves. And that, I think, undermines or underlies the main problem we have with some politicians today, is that people think the rules don't apply to them. And we're seeing that. I mean, we can go back and talk about Pam Helming's chief of staff, who I still can't believe she's not addressed this publicly yet. I mean, people are not above the rules, especially if they are in public office or in public service.
It is interesting because I do think, and I don't want to sound like I'm defending anybody, but I do think there's a level of naivete, I guess, would be the right word, just in terms of how deep that personal boundary gets pushed away from you. That sort of personal bubble that everybody's comfortable with and used to having around them gets pushed way, way out, and your circle is no longer what the circle was. And I think a lot of people who get into politics, especially if they aren't familiar with politics, I think you don't see it as much with the individuals who sort of rise through the ranks. They start as a board member, go to supervisor, and then working at the county level, and then they run for, a state seat. But I always wonder about these people who are sort of grassroots oriented and sort of get involved because there's a lot of people telling them to. I wonder if they really think about and process how deep that really cuts and how deep the personal bubble gets pushed out and extended.
Yeah, maybe not for the grassroots candidate, who I think, again, tends to be the exception as far as who's really getting into things. But I think, as you were talking, you just kind of, a light went on in my head that I think really what we're seeing is that a lot of people who tend to get into public office or who go for public office are of the group of people who are used to being protected, who are used to having their actions have, sorry, I'm distracted by the train, but the people who have their actions not bring about the same consequences all the time. So I think when you have people who feel like they're in a protected class moving into public office, then maybe the grassroots people say, oh, okay, maybe there are some boundaries, that there are certain things we don't talk about. Like, I know that guy's got a DWI, but no one said anything, so maybe we don't talk about personal lives. In that case, I could agree with you that grassroots people might be naive, but I think that is because they're joining a system that has been constructed to protect the secrets of people who are in power who don't want their secrets out. But that doesn't mean they shouldn't have told their secrets. So I guess that's what I'm saying.
And actually that's one of the, I think this whole sort of broad debate is one of the reasons why I've always thought that our system could use a good, solid, education of candidates who are entering it or trying to enter it, just so there's a thorough understanding of what the rules are, how it works, what could possibly happen, what some of the best practices are, and that sort of thing. That alone is a grassroots type of philosophy or concept. But I think something that's pretty important, especially given that this is one case of many over. We see it at the hyper-local level. We see it on the national scene. You see it everywhere in between.
Sorry, I don't mean to delay, but
no, go right ahead.
I think part of the problem also is that I think when we hear about stuff like this, sometimes what we say is, okay, I could never support somebody who participated in X, Y, Z, okay? And I think that perpetuates people keeping it hidden because they think, well, man, people aren't going to support me. But even though I have kind of like a zero tolerance DWI policy, because I find DWI to be one of the most offensive crimes in terms of disregard for your community and just putting everybody at risk and putting yourself above everybody else, I could see how candidates who maybe in their youth or in their past had some kind of DWI could still be candidates I might think I would be willing to support if they dealt with it in a particular way. If they said, hey, here's what happened, here were the circumstances, here's what I've done in the interim to make sure that doesn't happen again. I'd like to say that that's something I've left in the past and have moved on from. I think people could be forgiving in that way, and that might take some of the stigma off, although I do think there are things that are disqualifying. So I don't know.
I think the bottom takeaway is personal responsibility, take ownership of whatever has happened in your life. And, if you really want to put yourself out there as a candidate, put the full version of yourself out there as a candidate and not the, 65 to 70% version of yourself, right?
Yeah, because how you self-reflect and deal with an issue is just as important to getting a window into your character as somebody who's totally squeaky clean, right? So I think that we need to see the real people before we vote. That's what we're looking for, real people.
Yeah, real people. And more people, I think, also.
Yeah.
So obviously we have new news after a press conference late last week. Sandy Guardiola's family is filing $100 million wrongful death suit against the city of Canandaigua. The family held that press conference last week outlining issues within the investigative process and various conflicts within the facts of the case, or what they said are the facts of the case. State police handled the investigation, so the city says, hey, there was no bias here. The state handled this, whatever, keep us, they released a very, I'll say, it wasn't a defensive statement, but it was a very dismissive statement, or so it felt very dismissive, because it pretty much said, this is the state police's problem, basically. It's what they were saying. They said that because they didn't execute the investigation, there couldn't be any fault or any liability held by them by themselves or owned by themselves. The family also requested or raised questions about her employment, like where she was working, and suggested that there was some harassment taking place in her former office. She was a parole office. She was based out of Rochester and then relocated. Some questions about harassment there. They suggested that there might be another lawsuit filed on that part of it. Obviously, a lot to sort out there as far as the legal process goes. But I'm wondering what you're thinking now. Obviously, we're more than a year removed from the actual incident, the investigation, long been over, and now the family has made their next move. What is your feeling on it?
Yeah, I mean, timing-wise, that I don't feel like it's been too long. I mean, I think a 1-year anniversary does trigger additional attention to issues. But, I mean, let's not lose sight of the fact that a woman was in her home sleeping, and now she's dead. So I think any family member who could imagine a situation where a beloved member of your family who is at home sleeping ends up being shot to death might continue to wonder how that happened, want someone to be held accountable for it, want a sense of justice. So I don't find any actions that the family has taken to date to be out of line or unreasonable. I'm not sure what kind of relief or response or justice they should expect or will get, but I don't. It does surprise me anytime I hear an official statement that makes it sound like, well, I don't know, like, what more can we do? Well, I mean, we do need to keep acknowledging that someone was killed in their own home. And shouldn't we all be concerned with figuring out exactly how and why that happened? I mean, isn't that just kind of a fundamental protection of government, that we could be safe in our own house?
Yeah.
So, yeah, I don't find their action unusual at all, I guess, the families.
Yeah, I don't really think there's anything on that front that's unusual or different as far as that goes. It seems, the process seems pretty fair. Like you said, I agree. I don't think too much time has passed. That's kind of a odd thing to even, for folks to even be talking about. Right. The legal process is incredibly slow in this country anyway. It takes years to sort out virtually anything. Yeah,
anytime you lose somebody, like 1 year, if you ask people at the 1-year anniversary of a loved one's death, hey, hasn't it kind of been a long time? No, it hasn't been a long time. It's,
right.
Yeah.
And, I think one of the other parts of this that I've been thinking about is that, this isn't necessarily, it is, but it isn't an attempt to find out who is right and who is wrong. Obviously, the facts in this case seem to be completely jumbled. Right. And you have two completely different pathways to that day. You have the state police report, which was, one way, and then the family say something completely different happened because they conducted their own investigation. But I think some people are viewing this as a means to find out who is right and wrong. And I think that's always this is a civil case. That's not what this is. So this is, there is essentially a desire for a settlement because of the wrong that they feel was committed. Yeah. So it isn't going to necessarily be the situation where a traditional right-wrong outcome is found at the end. My guess would be that this is settled long before it actually goes to court. And it just sort of, it'll add to the skepticism that a lot of folks have with the system, and how the system sort of operates, and who it benefits, and how it functions. It raises a lot of questions there. And I talked about it on the radio last week with Ted Baker, because a lot of people now are saying, well, what happened? Well, this isn't the process to determine what really happened.
Right.
This is a civil process. And, where does that leave you, or where does that leave the community after this process is played out?
Right.
So a year from now, maybe this is settled. Where does that leave the community then?
Right.
I don't think there's a definitive answer on what really happened. I think you still have a split to some degree, whatever percentage split that is, where part of the community feels one way, or that it happened one way and believes one account, and the other believes the other.
Right.
And I even think in terms of law enforcement, it puts them in a very difficult position, because they're in a no-win situation. The family obviously is in a no-win situation. Right. They lost a family member. Mm-hmm. They are going to be dealing with that for the rest of their lives. And yet there probably won't be any hard policy or hard change that comes out as a result of this incident, or at least this part of the incident, which is the civil case that a lot of people are going to be focusing on now. Right. I mean, this will be in the headlines for months and months and months. Mm-hmm. But, so we'll continue to cover it. Obviously, link down below if you're watching us on YouTube, link in the story on fingerlakes1.com to read all about it and sort of see where everything stands. We'll continue to update this story. But we're going to shift gears here a little bit and talk about downtown revitalization. Okay. Everyone's favorite and most exciting topic to talk about. Penn Yan's the winner. It took longer this year, it seemed like, to find a winner in the Finger Lakes. Yeah. Usually these announcements, when was Geneva's announcement made? That's what I was going to ask you.
I thought Geneva's announcement was made in August or July.
Okay. So, I thought, because I remember it being very warm when the governor came to
they're usually summertime announcements, you know, because summertime in the Finger Lakes is when the governor wants to come to town and dole out his checks.
So Penn Yan defeated Seneca Falls and Newark, and I'm assuming others who were finalists here in the Finger Lakes region for the $10 million prize. Geneva and Watkins Glen were the previous winners. It's the program's third year existing and running, and a number of projects are now going to be funded in Penn Yan, focusing around water and connectivity between the village and the water, and that seems to be the MO of this whole project, as it happens every year, because it seems to be a new project every single year. Where does it stand now, though? We talked about it a few weeks ago on the program, because it feels like we're almost getting to here's the list of the candidates that we've been talking about and cycling through. Right. They're finalists, then they win.
Yeah, Penn Yan was not on my radar screen, right? So I initially said, oh yeah, Seneca Falls makes good sense. And then we had our program and I was like, whoa, you're totally right. Newark, yes, Newark deserves it. But we didn't even, I don't even think we discussed Penn Yan. So
here's my theory, and I'll make this quick. My theory on that is because Penn Yan doesn't have a town-specific or village-specific economic development wing. The county handles that for them, so they never push out a press release when they become a finalist, or when they're notified that they become a finalist. So I think just by merit of not having the PR drive to let people know, because they were finalists last year, and they may have been a finalist the year before that as well. I'm not sure, but this does to sort of piggyback off of that for those who might be wondering. Seneca Falls does have an economic development wing. Geneva, I'm assuming, does have that means. So I think that's how we got here, where Penn Yan popped up out of nowhere.
Right. And I think, Canandaigua was a finalist when Geneva was a finalist, I think. So it makes sense to think that they were in the mix, although I don't know if I remember reading that or not. But I'm assuming. I just assume if you were a finalist, you'd probably apply the next year. But, I mean, it makes sense to me that a place like Canandaigua wouldn't get it. In fact, I don't think they should ever get it because I don't think they meet the criteria. But I am starting to feel like what the governor tried to do. Now, I don't know. I don't know if this was his strategy, because this is really, if this was his strategy, this was incredibly clever. I don't know if he was playing this long game, but it seems to me like what the DRI has done is two things. It has acknowledged that upstate communities have been disinvested from by the state for years and years and years, and it has depressed our quality of life. So the first thing it did was kind of raise awareness that, oh, these cities need more funding to thrive. First thing. But the second thing is, and this is what I think is kind of a long-term thing that I hope was his plan, was to say, but throwing money at any community, not just upstate, but particularly upstate, throwing money at a problem is never a good strategy, because money alone is not going to solve the issue. What you need is a plan. So let's reward the people who've done good planning. So at this point, I feel like they could end the DRI process altogether and just say, communities that do good, community-minded planning, that can show broad support for a variety of efforts that don't leave anybody behind, will continue to receive enhanced funding from the state. And then put all these communities back in the mix. I mean, Newark deserves some money. Seneca Falls deserves some money. Okay. Not right now, because Seneca Falls clearly cannot plan right now. So Seneca Falls doesn't deserve any more money. But Geneva has this incredible comprehensive plan that has been being put into practice, right? They are managing their first DRI. Those projects are being put into practice. And where some of those projects maybe shouldn't be put into practice, because personally, I don't think we need a marina, the community still is being engaged. So we've learned our lesson, right? Upstate communities needed to get our acts together and have plans that people have buy-in for. But now, just give us the money, right? I feel like Cuomo should just say, okay, from now on, the communities that have figured it out get more. So I don't know if that was his long-term strategy, to show people the right way to do it and then to reward them, or if it just worked out that way.
I think it's just working out that way. And I'm not really sure if this, because there have been a lot of questions about sort of the community process that's happened in various communities, because it isn't structured by the state. It's structured by the individual community.
Right.
They have to come up with the plan themselves. I think there are a lot of questions as far as, what this is really doing. There are only so many communities that are eligible. And I think, if you look at the names of the communities, you can pretty quickly identify the ones in the Finger Lakes that are truly capable of producing this type of plan that could be, rewarded by getting a $10 million prize.
Right.
Seneca Falls is, of course, one of them. But essentially, you're saying the 2 or 3 largest individual townships or cityships or communities in each county in the Finger Lakes, and it excludes everyone else.
Well, okay, but I kind of think that's warranted, because one of the main problems that New York State has are these multiple layers of bureaucracy and suburban versus urban communities. And really, for efficiency's sake, we should be centralizing our resources and our investment in city centers, because cities are what are carrying the amenities that people are looking for, even in terms of services, colleges, whether private, public, community colleges, hospitals, social service offices, government buildings, schools, educational facilities. So I don't really have a problem with those population centers that provide those services, all tax exempt, getting a boost from the state to say, if you can find a way to maintain those services and maintain a quality of life that keeps those vibrant, because, I mean, if Geneva or Penn or Waterloo, I mean, if those communities tank, maybe those hospitals go away. If those communities tank, maybe we see a lack of expansion amongst colleges or community college programs. So I don't know. I tend to think that the population centers deserve the extra money.
I think I 50% agree. I agree that they deserve money. I don't think that they should be looped into the same program that, in theory, every community is supposed to be eligible for. In theory.
Okay. All right. That makes
sense.
So
I would break with you in terms of saying, yes, absolutely, find that funding for the communities that are going to work together, especially the ones who are carrying a larger portion of the burden.
Right.
But there also has to be a way to figure out how the Lodis, the Coverts, the really small, the Burdettes, the Bloomfields, how those communities can continue to operate, because you're seeing what these really rural municipalities are being faced with, and we're going to talk about Seneca Falls as being an example of this. It's becoming too expensive to even operate. So you can talk about, dissolving villages, you can talk about, streamlining services and, merging services, shared services with like the county or different townships. But there comes a point where you just can't anymore.
Well, we're a long way from that point. I do think government consolidation is still viable for a lot of, and I mean, just to look at Seneca County, look at how huge the county is, just kind of geographically, some of the diversity there. The idea that, okay, this is an area where I think Molinaro really speaks to people, and now I've seen his signs all over the place, so clearly he's getting the message that he's going to have some upstate resonance here. But a county government that is empowered to manage the rural areas is going to be far more efficient and effective than all of these individual municipalities trying to maintain their own systems independently. Now, I'm not saying they shouldn't have their own systems, because certainly, and we see in cases of like emergency management, you need the on the ground, in the community systems to work. But I think county government, which is also supported by the state, I think that is the purview of supporting and getting funds to these smaller communities. But this is a very nuanced discussion that we're trying to have in a short period of time. So I don't mean to say that what I'm offering is exactly the right answer, but
yeah, and I think some of the
ideas.
One of the challenges with, yes, I think there are ways you could continue to, work towards more merging of various services. But what you find in places you mentioned Seneca County as being an example, what you're finding already is that folks in the southern end of the county are going to Tompkins County for various things rather than actually staying with the county that is supposed to be,
right.
That they're paying taxes to.
Right.
So I don't think I think there's a limit, especially when you talk about how geographically expansive and diverse these communities are. The east-west divide in Ontario County is another sort of that same sort of discussion and debate.
Yep.
And I guess what I really am trying to get to as far as in relation to the DRI is just that there does have to be a better process that includes everyone, or maybe a separate program entirely on the economic development front that just allows for more communities to be involved. Because it does sort of seem now like we're rinsing and repeating. And I think, we talked about it last time we were here, I wouldn't be surprised to see Geneva be considered for a second round of funding.
I think we ought to be.
Before other before other communities get their share or what would be perceived as their share. So obviously we talked a little bit about Seneca Falls right there. But now the latest.
Oh man. Okay.
The latest in Seneca Falls. Yeah. Memorandum of Understanding showed up in local media the weekend before this past town board meeting. It outlined a $100 million deal, a new host agreement between the town of Seneca Falls and Seneca Meadows, which would keep the landfill operating through 2037. It guaranteed $5 million annually to the town, which Supervisor Greg Lazaro said should be embraced to ensure the town's financial viability and stability. The resolution introducing that memorandum was pulled about 5 minutes after the meeting started. So it disappeared, and it was done so at the town's attorney's advice, according to the supervisor. Then that following weekend, this past weekend, a story surfaced in the Finger Lakes Times outlining extensive budget cuts to police, cuts to virtually everything, the assessor's office, everything you could possibly imagine, the town clerk's office. And I think a lot of people have been reading this as this is a scare tactic to make people, say yes to a new host agreement. Right. Maybe, but I have a slightly different view on it. But I'm very curious what you think as, once again, the objective outsider in this situation. What is your feeling on this situation as it continues to unfold?
Well, I don't want you to fall into a false dilemma here, because it could be the case that budget cuts are needed and it's a scare tactic, okay? Because let me tell you that there is, I feel like I've seen this before. I think there might be a city attorney playbook that says when you're dealing with a big sum of money and a big deal that you want to make, the best way to get any people on the fence off of the fence is to put forward the scariest alternative so that they will hear from their constituents, well, we don't like the landfill, but you probably better keep doing it because we don't like all this other stuff more. So I would say, yes, it's a scare tactic, but that doesn't mean that on the face of it, though some of those things aren't still needed. From a financial perspective. But just to back up a second, if an elected official comes to anyone and says, if we don't get a $5 million bailout from the trash industry, we can't function, someone ought to say, then you should resign because clearly you've gotten us into a situation that is completely unsustainable. Because if we need to win the lottery to function, something has gone wrong structurally for a long time to get us to that place. But that doesn't seem to be what's being said. I mean, people are very upset at what appears to be, Let's make clear, I am not using the legal term of this because when attorneys are involved, I can imagine someone trying to say that I'm accusing people of nefarious things. When it looks like a bribe, when it looks like here's money for something you don't want because we know money will make it into something you can swallow, then that seems to me like you've gotten your community into a pretty bad situation. So I just think the whole thing's crazy. I think all this situation has done is to expose that the town of Seneca Falls must be horribly mismanaged financially, such that at least a couple of elected officials believe that they need a Hail Mary pass from a trash mountain in order to keep the doors open. That, to me, is the story. Like, what happened? And the step to remedy a situation like that is not to take the money. It's to replace the people and change the system, to completely reorganize. If your family were faced with a personal situation like this, you wouldn't just keep playing the lottery. You wouldn't just keep saying, let's take the bailout. You would say, we got to do something different, or we're going to find ourselves in the same situation and we're going to be beholden to these people even longer. I mean, this to me seems like people wouldn't run their households this way.
Yeah, and you know what? I think part of the, at least personally, one of the things that I keep thinking about is, the justification of increasing taxes. If you take Seneca Meadows out of the equation, it makes sense because of the infrastructure, the incredibly old infrastructure that this town has underneath its streets right now. But I think there again, pointing to the town board as the individuals who should be leading this charge, there hasn't been as much discussion around that fact as there probably should have been.
Right.
Throughout the whole, and I'm going beyond this, looking back before this particular board took over. Obviously, the problems that the town has or are experiencing now, they've been around forever. Especially with the landfill. The landfill is not a new issue. But I do think that the false dilemma that you're talking about is an important piece of this to remember and to keep in mind. That said, I don't think it should take away from the discussion, and I'm afraid it might, about just simply easing up on some of the services that are offered in Seneca Falls presently. If infrastructure is priority over services, then there are going to have to be some, checks and,
right.
Give ups on each side. And you can find a balance of where it's fair and works and is good. But there are some larger, more expensive things coming down the pipe for Seneca Falls and even Seneca County as a whole that, they have to be dealt with.
Right.
And, I think I look at this more from the infrastructure standpoint and say we shouldn't be using landfill money to do anything that is an essential function. It shouldn't be used to pay the salaries of our employees. It shouldn't be used to, it should literally be used on oddball items effectively. But that's not, it's treated in the budget as, water or sewer or whatever is generating income for a community, mm-hmm. or property taxes. And I feel like that isn't really the best way to operate. You know what, looking forward, I'm not really sure what is in this for Seneca Falls, because I don't think Seneca Falls, the town board right now, has the votes to pass any new host agreement. And I don't think the local law is going anywhere, the one that's currently intact. And, we're in a situation where elections are coming up next year. The residents of this community are going to have a lot of soul searching to do, and they're going to have to see some engagement and activity from folks who have very happily sat on the sidelines and just looked at this issue from afar, despite the fact that it impacts them very directly.
Yeah.
And my hope is that this is one of those things that actually encourages people to get engaged in local politics and to actually run for office and be more involved and go to town board meetings and that sort of thing, because that is really where the rubber meets the road on all of these issues. And it feels and seems like less of a surprise, because I know a lot of people felt like this new host agreement or the Memorandum of Understanding was a surprise, or they were blindsided by it. But if you were following along, if you were watching this town board, you had to, at least in the back of your mind, think that it was possible.
Well, I mean, and this is what I don't understand. And I guess this goes back to our initial, which I didn't realize it would tie things together so nicely, but that kind of Michael Steele point that you're hiring people to do the job and you need to evaluate if they're doing it well or not. So here's the thing to me. So it's no secret Seneca Falls was having financial difficulty. Now, what have we seen the town supervisor and board do this year to remedy that? They have hired an attorney and an IT director. They didn't have a legal or an internet problem. I mean, they had a financial problem. So why didn't somebody use those funds to bring in a financial manager? Why didn't those funds, I mean, this is the issue you get into when you have what I guess in the city would be called like a strong mayor form of government, but when you don't have an executive, right? Because I'm not saying you abdicate your responsibility to an unelected person, but if you don't have the expertise to fix your community's problems, you bring in the person with the expertise. So what we have seen is not just that the town board and town supervisor didn't have the expertise, they misdiagnosed the problem. They thought what we need to do is fight a lawsuit instead of get our house in order. And I'm telling you, Seneca Meadows has town of Seneca Falls over a barrel if you think that you're going to legally fight your way out of this thing. The issue is until the town of Seneca Falls gets sustainable in its own right so that it can say, we don't need you, you're always going to have the pull of the big money. It's always going to be the guys in their suits and cigars saying, well, we'll help you out. We'll do this. And if you've got a bunch of people, a bunch of guys who don't know what they're doing, they're going to say, well, sure, we'll do this because it avoids a lawsuit and it pays the bills. But they are not doing their job, which is to actually get the bills paid in a legitimate way.
Yep.
So I guess you can tell I feel strongly about this because you're right, people shouldn't be surprised that you're getting this negotiated MOU because when they sensed trouble, they hired an attorney. People should have been up in arms, and some people were, but there are not enough people in Seneca Falls paying attention, and they need to say, I'm sorry, we hired the wrong people for the job in terms of the town board. If they can't get a hold of this and clean house and do it the right way. And when I say clean house, I'm not talking about like the employees. I'm saying put your financial business in order. They should not be returning people to that board.
Agreed.
It doesn't make sense.
It gets back to engagement. We keep talking about this. It gets back to people actually being involved in politics and not just talking about politics or not just sitting on the sidelines complaining about their property taxes or otherwise. And
you're up against people who are very skilled at giving you shiny objects to distract your attention. Oh, we might have to cut these positions. Ooh, we might look at this. We might go to court for 30 years. No. Let's just focus on what really matters, the actual business of governing. We're running a deficit budget, and we don't have anybody with the financial management skills to get us out of it. That's the problem to be fixed. You can set the lawsuit stuff and the scare tactics aside. Just get down to business, and you'll get through it.
Yeah, and that puts a bow on this episode. That's for sure. I'm not even going to try to piggyback off of that. You're right. This is an issue that we're going to keep talking about. We're going to keep hearing about.
Unfortunately, I think so.
And it isn't going anywhere. I think it's only going to heat up in the next year as we get closer to elections again in Seneca Falls. But that's going to do it for us today. I'd like to thank everyone for watching. We will be back next week with another edition of the Debrief. But until then, don't forget to download the FingerLakes1.com app for the latest news, weather, sports, and podcasts like this one around the clock on your mobile device. For Jackie Augustine, I'm Josh Durso. We'll see you next time.